For 30 years, Iran operated on one core assumption: bury it deep enough and nothing can touch it. Nuclear centrifuges, missile production lines, high explosive testing chambers, all of it carved into mountains and buried under reinforced concrete and layers of packed earth, specifically engineered to survive anything a conventional airstrike could throw at it. That assumption has now been tested, disproven, and then tested again, over and over, at the exact same facilities, and every single time, the result has been the same. Let's walk through exactly how the United States and Israel have spent the past 2 years proving that no amount of rock and concrete actually guarantees safety anymore, why Iran keeps rebuilding these sites anyway, despite watching them get destroyed repeatedly, and what one recovered, but unexploded American bomb might mean for the next chapter of this entire technological standoff. Start with the operation that changed the entire calculation, because everything since traces back to it. In June of 2025, the United States launched what became known as Operation Midnight Hammer, the first operational combat use in history of the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, America's 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb. 6 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flew directly at Iran's Fordow fuel enrichment plant, a facility built deep inside a mountain in the remote hills of northwestern Iran, specifically because Iran's own engineers believed its depth made it functionally untouchable. Each of those 6 bombers dropped 6 GBU-57s apiece against Fordow's 2 main ventilation shafts. 14 bombs total, once you include additional weapons, dropped on the Natanz facility in the same operation. The targeting sequence itself was almost surgical in its logic. The first weapons struck the reinforced concrete covers protecting the ventilation shafts, blasting those defensive caps away to expose the shafts underneath, and then the follow-up bombs plunged straight down through those now exposed openings before detonating deep inside the mountain. That mission alone represented 15 years of planning and technical preparation, dating all the way back to 2006, when American intelligence first discovered Iran had begun constructing the underground Fordow complex in the first place. 15 years watching, planning, and engineering a single weapon specifically capable of reaching a facility Iran believed was permanently out of reach. The GBU-57 itself deserves a closer look, because understanding exactly how it works explains why Iran's entire underground strategy has become so much less reliable than it used to be. The bomb weighs roughly 30,000 pounds, about 13.5 metric tons, built from high-strength steel casing, specifically designed to survive the violent physical stress of punching through solid rock before its warhead ever detonates. It's engineered to penetrate somewhere in the range of 60 meters, close to 200 feet, of layered earth, rock, and reinforced concrete, using nothing but gravity and its own reinforced structure to physically drill downward before a smart fuse triggers the explosion at precisely the calculated depth. That detonation doesn't necessarily need to obliterate everything inside a target outright. Sometimes the goal is simply to collapse the structure around whatever's buried inside, rendering it permanently unusable, even if the underlying chamber technically survives the blast itself. Only the B-2 Spirit is currently certified to carry this specific weapon, and even then, only 2 at a time per aircraft, which tells you just how tightly constrained and deliberately planned every single mission using this bomb actually has to be. This isn't a weapon the United States can casually deploy dozens of times a week. It's a precision instrument reserved specifically for the handful of targets on the planet that nothing else can reliably reach, which is exactly why every single decision to actually commit it to a real strike carries this much strategic weight and this much careful advanced planning behind it. It's worth understanding exactly why Fordow specifically became the centerpiece of this entire underground strategy in the first place, because the facility's history explains a lot about how confident Iran genuinely was in its own engineering. Fordow was built into the side of a mountain near the city of Qom, specifically in response to Iran watching Israel repeatedly demonstrate its willingness and ability to strike more exposed nuclear facilities like Natanz over the preceding 2 decades. Iranian engineers deliberately positioned the enrichment halls deep enough that, for years, the working assumption among American and Israeli defense planners themselves was that no weapon in Israel's own arsenal could reliably reach it, which is precisely why so much of the international diplomatic pressure campaign around Fordow for over a decade focused on negotiated restrictions and inspections rather than any credible military option. Because credible military options against a facility like this simply didn't widely exist outside of America's own bunker buster program. That's what made the decision to actually commit the GBU-57 and the B-2 fleet directly into offensive use against Fordow. Such a genuinely historic moment in this conflict, it wasn't just another airstrike. It was the first real-world test of whether the single weapon specifically built to solve this exact problem actually worked as advertised, after nearly 2 decades of Fordow sitting there as the supposedly unsolvable case. There's also a genuinely interesting technical wrinkle worth bringing in here, because Even as the GBU-57 strikes on Fordow and Natanz were being celebrated as a major operational success, military analysts studying the strike footprint afterward, including specialists in China who maintain their own extensive interest in underground bunker warfare given their own investment in hardened facilities, pointed out real limitations in the weapon's effectiveness against the very deepest categories of underground targets. Their assessment noted that while the GBU-57 clearly succeeded in penetrating and damaging Fordow's ventilation infrastructure and upper enrichment halls, questions remained about how completely the weapon could destroy equipment situated at the absolute maximum depths some of these facilities are theoretically capable of reaching, particularly facilities engineered specifically with the GBU-57's known penetration limits already factored into their design. That's a genuinely sobering technical detail sitting underneath all the celebratory framing of Operation Midnight Hammer as a clean, total success. The weapon worked, and worked well, but even America's most powerful conventional bunker buster appears to have real physical limits that a sufficiently determined, sufficiently well-funded adversary could theoretically design around given enough time and enough depth to work with. That's exactly the kind of engineering challenge and response cycle that's defined this entire underground standoff from the very beginning. One side builds deeper, the other side builds a more powerful penetrator, and the cycle continues. Because Fordow and Natanz weren't isolated, one-time targets, they're part of a much broader pattern that's repeated itself again and again at a specific facility that perfectly captures Iran's entire underground philosophy and its ultimate futility. That facility is called Taleghan 2, buried inside the Parchin military complex roughly 20 to 36 miles southeast of Tehran, one of Iran's largest and most sensitive military industrial sites, where the country produces and stores warheads, missile engines, and other weapon systems. Taleghan 2's history goes back to Iran's Ahmad Plan, the country's secret nuclear weapons development program from the early 2000s, and the facility specifically housed a high explosive test chamber and flash X-ray equipment used to study the physics of detonating a nuclear device. This wasn't some minor storage depot. It was one of the most sensitive weapons development facilities Iran had ever built. Israel struck Taleghan 2 for the first time back in October of 2024, and high-resolution satellite imagery afterward confirmed the building had been completely destroyed. That should have been the end of it. Instead, satellite imagery started showing new construction activity at the exact same site within months, with visible rebuilding efforts beginning in earnest by May of 2025. Iran didn't relocate this program somewhere new after watching it get flattened. It rebuilt on the exact same footprint, adding a roof specifically designed to conceal the ongoing reconstruction work from overhead surveillance, a decision that speaks volumes about how deeply committed Iran remained to this exact location despite having every opportunity to simply start over somewhere less exposed. That construction site wasn't touched during the broader June 2025 strikes against Fordow and Natanz, giving Iran additional months to keep building, reinforcing the structure with a steel frame and metal roof, then pouring concrete over the entire thing before finally burying it under a fresh layer of packed earth, essentially recreating the same deep burial strategy that had already failed once before at this exact location. Then came March of 2026, when Israel struck Taleghan 2 for a second time. High-resolution satellite imagery captured on March 11th showed 3 distinct bunker buster penetration holes punched directly through the top of the facility, landing precisely in the area where analysts believed Iran had rebuilt its high-explosive containment vessel, the exact equipment needed for nuclear weapons-related testing. The shockwave from that second strike was powerful enough to collapse a separate support building just outside Taleghan 2 entirely, while additional munitions in the same operation destroyed a nearby fire control and instrumentation building, along with a facility headquarters building sitting close by. 2 strikes, 18 months apart, against the exact same coordinates, and Iran had rebuilt the entire facility from scratch in between, only to watch it get punched through again by weapons specifically designed to find it no matter how much concrete and dirt got piled on top. And here's the detail that genuinely captures the entire theme of this story better than almost anything else in this whole conflict. By July of 2026, just months after that second strike, satellite imagery obtained by CNN and analyzed by the Institute for Science and International Security showed Iran was already rebuilding Taleghan 2 for a third time. Workers were documented installing rebar mesh directly over the bomb penetration holes from the March strike, a construction technique specifically intended to support a new permanent reinforced concrete cap sealing the underground facility once again. Analysts described what they were seeing plainly: significant activity indicating a genuine Iranian commitment to repair and restore the site, despite watching it get destroyed not once but twice at the exact same location. When American officials were asked directly about this reported reconstruction, the response was blunt. The administration reiterated that Iran cannot be allowed to retain its enriched uranium, and that the United States had already, in its own words, obliterated Iran's nuclear sites, ballistic missiles, and production facilities during both Operation Midnight Hammer and the broader Operation Epic Fury campaign that followed, while making clear these sites remain under continuous, close observation. That destroy, rebuild cycle at a single facility tells you almost everything you need to understand about the deeper standoff still playing out underneath the surface of this entire war. Iran isn't behaving like a country that's accepted the underground strategy no longer works. It's behaving like a country that's still fundamentally betting on burial and concealment as its core defensive doctrine, even after watching that exact doctrine fail twice at the exact same coordinates. A level of institutional stubbornness that says as much about Iran's broader strategic mindset as it does about the specific engineering choices involved. Whether that reflects genuine strategic stubbornness, a calculated bet that American and Israeli patience or political will to keep striking the same site repeatedly will eventually run out, or simply a lack of any viable alternative given how deeply this underground infrastructure strategy is baked into Iran's broader military and nuclear doctrine, is a genuinely open question worth sitting with rather than dismissing outright. But the pattern itself is undeniable. Bury it, get caught rebuilding it, watch it get destroyed again, then start rebuilding again almost immediately, 3 separate times now at a single facility alone. Taleghan 2 isn't even the most significant unresolved underground site still sitting on the table right now, and that's worth understanding clearly because it shows this entire underground standoff is far from finished. Just south of the Natanz nuclear complex sits a site analysts refer to as Pickaxe Mountain, sometimes labeled the Mount Kolan Gaz Law Complex, an underground tunnel facility that's been under continuous, steady construction since late 2020, well before this current war ever began. There's also a separate older tunnel complex nearby, one that nuclear monitoring analysts date back to around 2007, adding yet another layer of buried, unresolved infrastructure to an already complicated picture in that exact stretch of terrain. This site hasn't been inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency at any point, and it's specifically slated for either centrifuge-related activities or potentially housing stocks of enriched uranium, according to assessments from nuclear monitoring analysts. Unlike Fordow, Natanz, and Taleghan 2, Pickaxe Mountain was not among the facilities struck during the initial wave of attacks, back in June of 2025, meaning it's sat there this entire time, deep inside a mountain, continuing construction, representing exactly the kind of unresolved underground threat that keeps this entire conflict from reaching any kind of clean, final resolution on the nuclear question specifically. Every month the facility remains unstruck and under continued construction is a month where Iran's underground strategy, whatever its ultimate track record elsewhere, continues advancing completely unimpeded. There's also a genuinely unexpected twist in this story that deserves real attention, because it flips the entire premise on its head in a way that should worry American planners specifically. Iranian reports out of Zanjan province claim that 4 GBU-57 bombs were discovered in the aftermath of strikes in that region, with 3 destroyed on site by Iranian recovery teams, but 1 recovered fully intact and handed over to Iranian authorities. If accurate, that's an extraordinary intelligence windfall for a country that's spent the better part of this entire war on the receiving end of this exact weapon. The GBU-57 represents the single most technically advanced non-nuclear bunker buster the United States has ever built. And even partial reverse engineering of an intact example could meaningfully advance Iran's own understanding of penetrator warhead design, fusing mechanisms, and structural materials capable of surviving that kind of violent underground impact. This isn't a purely theoretical concern either. There's real precedent here. Back in 2011, Iran managed to capture a single intact American RQ-170 Sentinel stealth drone near the city of Kashmir, and the intelligence Iran extracted from that single captured airframe fed directly into a decade-long expansion of Iran's own indigenous stealth drone program, eventually producing operational combat platforms like the Shahed 171 Simorgh and the Shahed 191 Saikeh. If a single captured drone could generate that much downstream capability, a single, fully intact example of America's most advanced conventional bunker buster represents a genuinely serious strategic exposure, one made worse by reporting that GBU-57 production itself already faces real inventory constraints tied to specialized manufacturing bottlenecks and limited single-source industrial suppliers, meaning every single weapon in the American arsenal carries outsized strategic value that a lost or captured example only makes more painful to lose. Every bomb that gets fired and never recovered is one thing, but a bomb that gets fired, fails to detonate, and then gets physically handed over to the exact adversary it was built to defeat is a different category of problem entirely. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, actually tied this recovered ordnance issue directly into the broader nuclear diplomacy conversation, stating publicly that unexploded munitions still lodged inside key nuclear facilities like Fordow were creating serious safety barriers, preventing international inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency from actually accessing the site. That's a genuinely complicated diplomatic wrinkle sitting on top of an already complicated military and technical story. Unexploded American ordnance still physically present inside the exact facilities the international community wants inspected, giving Iran a legitimate-sounding safety justification for continuing to restrict access, regardless of whatever underlying political motivations might also be at play, and one that international negotiators have found genuinely difficult to counter given the real, documented physical hazard unexploded ordnance actually represents to inspection teams on the ground. It's also worth situating these underground strikes inside the broader arc of how this entire war has actually unfolded, because the campaign against Iran's buried infrastructure never happened in isolation from everything else going on simultaneously. The war that produced Operation Midnight Hammer is now widely referred to by analysts simply as the 12-Day War, a remarkably compressed time frame in which Israel first struck Iran's more exposed nuclear infrastructure before the United States committed its own bomber fleet directly against Fordow and Natanz. That same broader conflict later escalated dramatically again in February of 2026 with Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated wave of strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader, along with several of its most senior military commanders, in a single devastating night, an event that reshaped Iran's entire command structure and, as this underground story shows, apparently did nothing to change the underlying nuclear and missile infrastructure strategy Iran's remaining leadership has continued pursuing, regardless of who's actually issuing the orders inside Tehran. That continuity matters, because it tells you the underground rebuilding strategy at sites like Taleghan 2 isn't tied to any single decision-maker's personal preference. It's baked into Iran's institutional approach to nuclear and weapons infrastructure at a level deep enough to survive even a near-total decapitation of the country's top political and military leadership. Independent nuclear monitoring analysts conducted a comprehensive assessment of Iran's nuclear sites roughly 5 months after the 12-day war concluded, cataloging the status of every major facility that had been targeted during that initial campaign, alongside the sites that had been deliberately left untouched. That assessment specifically flagged Pickaxe Mountain and Taleghan 2 as the two most significant open questions remaining, precisely because construction and reconstruction activity continued at both locations well after the war's initial phase had technically ended. That kind of systematic, ongoing monitoring effort, satellite imagery analyzed month after month by independent nuclear watchdog organizations working entirely outside of government channels, has become one of the most important tools available for actually tracking whether Iran's underground strategy is succeeding or failing in real time, filling in details that official government statements from either side often leave deliberately vague. Without that kind of independent satellite tracking, the full scope of Iran's repeated rebuilding efforts at Taleghan 2 specifically, 3 separate attempts at the same coordinates, might never have become public knowledge at all, buried, quite literally, under layers of concrete, packed earth, and official silence from every government actually involved. It's worth understanding exactly why Iran built this entire underground infrastructure network in the first place, because the logic, however ultimately flawed it's proven to be, was never irrational on its own terms. Iran spent decades constructing what analysts describe as missile cities, extensive military bases carved deep inside the Zagros Mountains, protected by hundreds of meters of natural rock layered on top of reinforced concrete construction. These facilities were purpose-built to house ballistic missiles and launch systems specifically designed to survive standard airstrikes, the kind of conventional bombing that had defined most modern aerial warfare for decades before the GBU-57 ever entered service. For a very long stretch of military history, that calculation held up perfectly well. Sufficient depth genuinely did mean sufficient protection, because no country besides the United States possessed a weapon physically capable of reaching 200 feet underground with the precision needed to actually destroy a hardened target rather than simply cratering the surface above it. Israel, for context, possesses its own bunker buster capability, but limited to 2,000 and 5,000 pound variants, genuinely useful against a wide range of hardened targets, but nowhere near capable of matching the GBU-57's combination of raw penetrating mass and precision at depths approaching 200 feet. Only the United States has ever fielded a weapon in that specific weight and capability class, which is exactly why Fordow, purpose-built specifically to be Israel-proof, given Israel's own bunker buster limitations, was never actually America-proof in the same way, a distinction that turned out to matter enormously once Washington decided to commit its own aircraft and its own weapons directly to this fight. That's really the deeper strategic story sitting underneath every one of these underground strikes. Iran built its entire defensive nuclear and missile doctrine around a threat model that assumed Israel alone, or Israel plus a reluctant United States providing only indirect support, represented the ceiling of what it needed to defend against. The moment the United States committed its own B-2 fleet and its own GBU-57 inventory directly into offensive strikes against these facilities, that entire threat model collapsed instantly, because the one weapon capable of genuinely neutralizing Iran's deepest, most hardened sites had never actually been used in combat before Operation Midnight Hammer proved it worked exactly as designed. Every underground facility Iran built over the preceding 2 decades was engineered against a threat that, until that specific mission, had never actually been tested in real combat conditions. Once it was tested, and once it worked, the fundamental premise underlying Iran's entire underground defense strategy stopped being a reasonable assumption and started being a demonstrably false one, repeated proof of which keeps accumulating at facility after facility. There's also a fascinating intelligence dimension running underneath this entire rebuild cycle, because Iran isn't rebuilding blind to the fact that it's being watched. Every attempt to conceal reconstruction work at Taleghan 2, the temporary covering of impact holes, the installation of rebar mesh ahead of a permanent concrete cap, the roofing structures specifically built to obscure activity from satellite passes overhead, represents Iran actively trying to outmaneuver an intelligence surveillance apparatus that's become increasingly sophisticated at tracking exactly this kind of activity in near real time. Commercial satellite imagery providers, combined with independent analysis from nuclear watchdog organizations, have essentially created a persistent, largely unblinking eye over every single one of Iran's known underground and hardened facilities, meaning the kind of concealment that might have worked adequately against slower, less consistent intelligence, gathering decades ago simply doesn't provide the same protective value anymore. Every rebuilding attempt gets documented, dated, and analyzed almost as it happens, stripping away much of the strategic advantage Iran might otherwise gain from quietly reconstituting these facilities out of public view. That persistent surveillance layer is arguably just as important to this entire story as the bunker buster bombs themselves, because a weapon capable of destroying a hardened facility is only useful if you actually know precisely when and where to send it, and it's exactly that combination. Powerful penetrating munitions paired with relentless, continuous satellite tracking that's made Iran's underground strategy so much less reliable than it was ever designed to withstand. There's an economic dimension to this repeated rebuild cycle that deserves attention too, because every reconstruction effort at a facility like Taleghan 2 isn't cheap or quick, even for a government willing to absorb the cost. Rebuilding a hardened underground facility capable of housing sensitive, high-explosive testing equipment requires specialized engineering expertise, reinforced steel framing, precisely mixed concrete, formulated to resist future penetration, and enough skilled labor to complete the work without the kind of visible above-ground activity that would immediately draw fresh satellite scrutiny and, potentially, another strike before construction even finishes. Iran has been absorbing that cost 3 separate times now at this single facility alone, on top of whatever parallel reconstruction and construction efforts are simultaneously underway at Fordow, Natanz, and Pickaxe Mountain, all while the broader Iranian economy continues struggling under the weight of sustained sanctions, a naval blockade squeezing oil export revenue, and the general economic disruption that comes with fighting an active, sustained war on multiple fronts simultaneously. Every dollar and every skilled engineer redirected toward rebuilding a facility that's already been destroyed twice is a dollar, and an engineer not available for literally anything else the Iranian state might otherwise need, whether that's conventional military reconstitution, domestic economic stabilization, or addressing the kind of public unrest that sustained economic pain has already generated at multiple points throughout this conflict. That's the quiet, unglamorous cost side of Iran's underground strategy that rarely gets discussed alongside the dramatic satellite imagery of bomb craters and collapsed buildings. Every single rebuild represents real resources permanently diverted away from every other priority competing for Iran's shrinking wartime budget. There's a certain sunk cost logic at play here that's worth acknowledging honestly. Decades of investment, billions of dollars, and an entire generation of engineering expertise have been poured into this underground infrastructure strategy. And abandoning it entirely would mean conceding that the foundational premise of Iran's nuclear and missile defense doctrine was fundamentally broken from the start. It's also worth considering that Iran may simply be betting on time and political fatigue rather than technical secrecy at this point, understanding that even a weapon as effective as the GBU-57 requires enormous political will, careful intelligence preparation, and a genuinely committed American administration willing to authorize repeated strikes against the same coordinates over and over as reconstruction continues. If Iran can simply outlast the political appetite for continuing these strikes indefinitely, rebuilding patiently after each attack, regardless of how many times it takes, The underground strategy doesn't need to guarantee permanent protection. It just needs to buy enough time between each strike to make incremental progress toward whatever underlying capability Iran is actually trying to preserve or reconstitute. That's precisely why the still unstruck Pickaxe Mountain complex matters so much more than it might initially seem, sitting there this entire time, continuing construction completely uninterrupted since 2020, representing the clearest possible test case for whether Iran's underground strategy still has a viable path forward anywhere, even after everything that's happened at Fordow, Natanz, and Taleghan 2. If that facility eventually gets struck and destroyed the same way its counterparts have been, it reinforces the conclusion that depth alone genuinely doesn't guarantee safety against a determined adversary willing to keep applying precision and penetrating munitions repeatedly. But if it remains untouched, continuing construction indefinitely while diplomatic negotiations and other fronts of this war consume American and Israeli attention elsewhere, it suggests Iran's underground doctrine hasn't actually been defeated so much as it's simply been forced to accept a much higher, much more painful cost of doing business, one measured in repeated destruction and repeated reconstruction, rather than in permanent, guaranteed protection the way the original doctrine promised decades ago. So where does that leave the actual answer to the question sitting in this story's title? Did the United States genuinely prove Iran's underground weapons were never truly safe? The evidence is about as conclusive as evidence gets in modern warfare. Fordow got hit, and hit hard, despite sitting deep inside a mountain specifically engineered to be untouchable. Taleghan 2 got hit, rebuilt, hit again, and is now being rebuilt a third time. An almost absurd cycle that captures both how effective these penetrating strikes genuinely are and how stubbornly committed Iran remains to the underlying strategy, regardless of the repeated failures. And the capture of an intact GBU-57 shows this entire technological contest cuts both ways. Every weapon fired that fails to detonate becomes a potential blueprint handed directly to the adversary it was designed to defeat. Depth alone, it turns out, was never actually the guarantee of safety Iran spent decades and billions of dollars betting it would be. But that hard-won lesson hasn't stopped Tehran from continuing to bet on it anyway. Site after site, strike after strike, rebuild after rebuild. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Iran will eventually abandon this underground strategy entirely once the cumulative cost of repeated destruction and reconstruction becomes too expensive to sustain? Or do you think Tehran keeps rebuilding indefinitely, betting that political will on the other side eventually runs out before its own engineering capacity does? It's a genuinely open question, and the honest answer probably depends less on any single military calculation and more on which side runs out of patience, resources, or political appetite first. A race that's just as much about economics and endurance as it is about bombs and bunkers. Drop your honest take in the comments, because this specific pattern, buried, struck, rebuilt, struck again, is genuinely one of the clearest windows into how both sides are actually thinking about this entire conflict's endgame. And it says more about the underlying war of attrition than most of the headline-grabbing strikes ever managed to convey on their own. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly how these bunker-buster strikes actually work, and why Iran keeps returning to the same underground playbook despite watching it fail repeatedly, go ahead and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps detailed sourced analysis like this reach more people trying to actually follow this war, instead of just catching a headline about another airstrike without any of the deeper context, the history, or the repeated pattern behind it. Subscribing means you'll be right here the moment Pickaxe Mountain or any other still standing underground facility finally gets struck. And given how consistently this specific pattern keeps repeating throughout this war, that moment likely isn't far off, whether it comes in the form of a fourth strike on Taleghan 2 or something entirely new at a site nobody's watching closely yet. And if you know anyone who still assumes burying a facility deep enough automatically makes it safe from modern airstrikes, share this with them. Because Taleghan 2 alone, destroyed and rebuilt 3 separate times at the exact same coordinates, is about as clear a real-world rebuttal to that assumption as you're ever going to find. A single facility that's somehow become the single best case study for this entire war's underground standoff. Thanks for watching all the way through. Stay close to this one, because as long as Iran keeps rebuilding and the bombers keep coming back, there's clearly a lot more of this exact story still to be written. Between the still unstruck Pickaxe Mountain complex, the ongoing question of what Iran actually learned from that one recovered bunker buster, and a third reconstruction effort now underway at Taleghan 2, this specific underground standoff remains one of the clearest, most measurable threads running through this entire war.